Theodore Roosevelt once said, "The more you know about the past, the better prepared you are for the future." Hello, my name is Monique Harlan, and I am a Community Relations Specialist with Michigan Schools and Government Credit Union. MSGCU was founded by educators over 60 years ago, and we still believe in the power of education. It is our honor and privilege to partner with the Oakland Literacy Council to provide today's presentation. Hopefully, we will all leave knowing how the events of 50 years ago in Pontiac have shaped our communities and education systems today. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you to Michigan Schools and Government Credit Union for supporting today's presentation. My name is Alicia Stevens, and I serve as a board member of the Oakland Literacy Council. I'm also the chair of the Oakland Literacy Council's Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Committee. Over the past year, all of us have witnessed an outpouring of public support to bring about a more racially just America. The Oakland Literacy Council fully embraced those efforts. One of our commitments was to provide opportunities like today's presentation so members of our community can learn about racial injustice and the resulting educational inequities in Oakland County. As you may know, the Oakland Literacy Council is a nonprofit organization that provides free tutoring to adults in our community who read at less than a high school level. Every year, we provide more than 12,000 hours of instruction to almost 200 students. Many of our adult students lack the literacy skills needed to achieve economic success for themselves and their children. Many experience firsthand educational inequities that are barriers to literacy and prosperity. Today, you will learn about an intense time in the history of Pontiac for their schools, including the 1970 court order to racially integrate at the elementary level. This resulted in conflicts, violence, and finally, long-lasting impacts on the community. I was born and raised in Pontiac, as was my mother. She vividly remembers living through the events that you'll hear about tonight, which directly shaped my childhood and my view of the world. Whether you know nothing about these events or have personal memories and experiences, we hope today's presentation will provide you a new perspective and context on the challenges our schools and communities face. Now, we want this to be an engaging event for everyone, so the chat will be open for all of your comments throughout the event. We encourage you to ask questions today. Please submit your questions using the Q&A feature found at the bottom of your screen. Questions will be answered following the presentation. You will also receive a survey for the event via email after it concludes. Your feedback matters. In that email, you will receive an invitation to continue this conversation next Thursday, February 25th at 7 p.m. Now it is my pleasure to introduce our speaker and partner in this event, Mike McGinnis. Mike is the executive director of the Oakland History Center, located in Pontiac. Mike brings not only deep historical knowledge of Pontiac and its schools, but also a current perspective on the city. While a student at Oakland University, Mike worked as an AmeriCorps employee in Pontiac schools. Today, he lives in Pontiac and has served on the Pontiac School Board since 2016, currently as board president. And now, without further ado, I bring you Mike McGinnis.
Well, good evening. Thank you so much for the opportunity, Alicia, and all of the Oakland Literacy Council. Really delighted to partner. I love Pontiac, I love my community, and I love our fascinating, rich history. We're taking a deeper dive today into a really intense time where it was literally the biggest story in Michigan. They took a survey of the newspapers. This was the biggest story by far 50 years ago. Throughout this year, we want to take a closer look, and that includes your stories. So we're collecting oral histories, and we want your perspectives, your images, your clippings, your recollections, because that helps inform and enrich our reflections on this very important time in history. So I'm going to start the PowerPoint here just as a visual stimulation when I'm able to share that with you. But Pontiac has been overshadowed in many respects by Flint and Detroit, larger communities to our north and south that definitely get more attention, are often get more resources. But in this time in history, this was the time where Pontiac was definitely getting the lion's share of attention, and that was regarding the desegregation process for our schools. And I'll just ask the Literacy Council if you can give me screen sharing rights, so that way I make that magic happen. But Pontiac was and still is the county seat for Oakland County. Many of you on the call tonight might have that frame of reference, but it's been a community for over 200 years and the county seat of Oakland County in that time. For most of its history, it was the largest and most developed community, and it also had the first high school and school district in Oakland County. Still says that host disabled participant screen sharing, so we'll deal with that. But this is a very seminal time as we look back 50 years later, and all good now. I'm Sharon. I'm live. So thank you for indulging me on that. We are in this corridor with Flint and with Saginaw and Detroit, and we have a very similar life cycle as a community, but very unique challenges and opportunities as well. That's true historically, and that's also true today. I mentioned that we were the earliest and most substantial school district. Early on, Oakland County was surrounded by farmland and rural areas. Pontiac was sort of the most substantial development in the county for generations. We have something that really took a turn not only for our city, but the entire region and state, and that's the Automotive Revolution. Historically, Pontiac and Flint were producing some of the most carriages in the country. Carriages, wagons, buggies, and they used that infrastructure and personnel and technological infrastructure to quickly make a transition with the invention of the combustion engine to start turning those into car and truck startups. There were no less than 40 different startup companies. We were the Silicon Valley of our era, and that was true for that industrial corridor, Detroit up to Saginaw. And it really transformed life in Pontiac, and it also transformed the population. Rapid job growth led to need for new workers, and rapid growth of neighborhoods and support services, but also demand on our schools. Little frame of reference, that blue dot is where I live today, across from an old elementary school that's been empty for decades, but a beautiful historic central school. And from 1910 to 1930, we see the population of Pontiac doubling every 10 years. So going from 14,000 plus to 65,000 in just 2 decades. Dramatic impact on the infrastructure and the population, and that was meeting the auto boom and all the opportunities that came through that transformation economically. And in that process, General Motors was gobbling up all those auto startups that were happening here in Pontiac, and we were transitioning into a one-company GM town. As the population was growing, the population was also diversifying. The Great Migration was a national, very fascinating, and that could be many historic presentations on its own, where thousands of African Americans and whites from the South were moving northward to the industrial meccas to find newfound opportunity, and that was absolutely true for Pontiac. We also uniquely had a substantial growth in the Mexican American population. A lot of the early work in the auto factories in Pontiac was grueling, difficult, toxic, literally poisonous work. And while they had difficulty filling those jobs, period, and they needed more workers, those hardest jobs, they turned to Black and Mexican workers to work in those foundries and in that intense heat and smell and the metals. I can't even begin to wrap my mind around it, but it was intense. And as those new Black and Mexican workers migrate up to Pontiac for work, the question of where they live is central. And the options were limited. As with other northern cities, there was segregated housing and racially restrictive covenants built in to those properties and the neighborhoods. So even renting was very difficult. And here's a little aerial view of Pontiac that gives you a little bit of a sense of what is Orchard Lake Road was sort of the northern boundary. It was southwest Pontiac where early African-American migrants were settling and making a thriving life despite the segregation and racism that still existed, though not as intense and violent as one was escaping the South. You see the purple label there for the corner. That is the sort of center of life and vitality of the Black business corridor and religious and civic and cultural life, a really thriving era that one positive aspect to that segregated experience was a real flourishing of Black life in Pontiac. When it came to the schools, those boxes in black show the schools that were almost exclusively African American, and they were intentionally outlined that way. In the 19-teens, all the way to the 1950s, the schools in Pontiac were absolutely segregated. And it wasn't until Brown v. Board of Education in 1954 that they even began to remotely scratch the surface of that transformation. The green schools you see, those are almost exclusively white schools in the earliest decades of the Great Migration and this population boom. Pontiac High is an early outlier of having an integrated student body because as students of multiple races matriculate up, there was the one high school in the city. We see the Depression slowing things down a bit with opportunities and population growth in the 30s, but then World War II breaks out. And I'm sure you've heard of the Arsenal of Democracy, and maybe Willow Run or Detroit has caught your attention with that. Pontiac was absolutely in that mix. Our auto factories were transformed to make duck boats. GMC trucks went around to Europe. We had torpedoes, anti-aircraft missiles, you name it. So Rosie the Riveters, both white and Black, and African-American workers from the South still were being a beacon of labor and work opportunities here in Pontiac as it was in the other industrial centers of our state. And so World War II sets off another population and work boom. So more rapid job growth, more migration, the population booms, as does the need for schools, and then the tax base that comes with it. Give you a little, you can see there visually how the population continues to grow exponentially. It's in this time that the previously rural outer areas of Oakland County are starting to balloon in population as well. That's not just outgrowth from Pontiac and established families and population out migrating from there. It's also coming from the Detroit metropolitan suburban growth, especially in those southern tiers of Oakland County. That's happening at this similar cycle, and new school districts and new communities from whence there was none are definitely growing. We see, it's worth pointing out that we have 8 different cities that are all or part of the Pontiac School District, because when it was the largest and most resource lush, the rural and less populated areas, they wanted in on that action. They wanted to join the Pontiac School District so that way they could also have their children attending and being in that, really that magnet and that draw for further development because it was such a large and successful and growing school system. Of those municipalities, it was Pontiac that had the Black and Mexican populations. And as that migration continues, that was almost exclusively true in those early decades. We have, in that era, as with before, the school board for Pontiac were made up of successful businessmen, always white, and almost always exclusively men. It's also worth noting that we know Open Meetings Act. I'm the president of the school board these days. You must do meetings out in the open and make decisions so that the citizens can know and participate. That wasn't so much the case if you go 100 years and back. So it was definitely behind closed doors, a lot of decisions that were reinforcing the existing power and social systems that were happening in Pontiac. And that was true at the municipal level as well as the schools level. So the one angle is what's happening with the Black and minority students and where they're attending school. But another very relevant question to this era is, where is the Black employees? Where are the teachers and the staff of any race other than white? And for most of the history of Pontiac schools until the 1950s, there were none. One example of that is in the flagship school of the school district, Pontiac High. Out of 120 plus staff, it was 0 to 1. And then when they started broaching the 60s, it finally got to 2 and then 3. it was a big deal and a big challenge that we'll hear more about. In the early 1950s, a brilliant legal mind, Milton Henry, who later was a contemporary of Malcolm X, he was on the Pontiac City Commission, and he started calling out how the racial segregation of Pontiac schools were harming the growing Pontiac Black population. And he was have advocating for fair housing laws that had not yet come on the books in Pontiac and didn't have any federal support either. We have the first Black school board member elected in 1955, Reverend J. Allen Parker. He was from Newman AME Church in that Bagley corridor. And so he made history then, but even still, he was a lone voice advocating for humane and quality treatment for African-American students, much more so than was the prevailing sentiment in Pontiac. And that's true for many communities as well. They were just really beginning to scratch the surface of what it means to care for and educate and employ their Black citizens. Brown v. Board of Education comes, and Milton Henry brings a lawsuit saying that based on that constitutional guarantee now of not allowing racial segregation in public schools, that Pontiac schools need to shape up because it was really a few entirely Black schools and almost all entirely white schools opposite. And it was following the racially restrictive and segregated housing patterns that Pontiac was employing, but it also was experiencing administrative segregation, where the city and schools leadership were reinforcing the racist desires of many residents to keep things the way they were. The status quo was what many white residents in the early decades were after. We also see a change in leadership. The superintendent now for Pontiac is Dana Whitmer. You may recognize that last name. He is actually the grandfather of Michigan's current governor, Gretchen Whitmer. And he came from the Gary, Indiana schools, and he was seen as a strong and had a very long tenure, and he's the superintendent through this saga. With this population boom, you see Whitmer there charting out with the school board and administrators, what are they gonna do with all these students? And that wasn't limited racially. There was just an explosion of children, and that's the baby boom. As the baby boom is rare and hardcore, more and more students are vexing the infrastructure of Pontiac schools, and they start building schools like crazy. They go from 19 schools to 37 schools in their system. That's a big jump in just a few short years. We also see a growth and expansion of the location in Pontiac where Black and Mexican residents are settling. So that southwest corner is not sufficient. And there is also a housing project, Lakeside Homes, that's built, but the southeast part of Pontiac, where there were many first-generation European immigrants in the early 19-teens and 20s coming for the factory work, as they matriculate out and move to the suburbs or get nicer homes, that affordable older housing stock is occupied by homeowners and renters that were Black and Mexican. So schools that were formerly all white are now becoming either all Black or integrated, as they're also adding new schools online. You also see, because of that, the community's informal sense of where the Blacks live is not just south of Orchard Lake, it's south of Auburn as well, where the road continues on both sides of town. We have this is a school that means a great deal to many people. This was Pontiac High School, built in the teens. And then as that population of the students expands dramatically, a second high school is built. The new Northern High School on the north side of town, logically, is almost 100% white. They built the newest school where the biggest growth was, but also where the sort of wealth and the power, the political power, the voter power was in the white part of the city. So Pontiac High becomes Pontiac Central, and that's just one example of many of the school growth. To give you a sense of what we're talking about with the racial breakdown of Pontiac, this is from Time magazine in the late 60s when they were covering the growing hot button issue of integration of Pontiac schools. This is oversimplified, but they're talking about the 30,000 Black residents, 4,000 Hispanic, and then they're delineating whites that are from Michigan or already lived in Pontiac versus those who are migrants from the South. And that's a common thread that comes in this storyline, is how Southern whites coming to the North, specifically in this instance, Pontiac, and bringing their racist prejudices or bringing their views of Blacks and their role in society or where it should be. That is oversimplified, but it's definitely a common thread here. And also there was a few more thousand people that live in Pontiac then, but that's how it was being portrayed nationally. We have issues through the civil rights struggle that aren't limited to the South, that aren't limited to the big cities. The struggles manifest in Pontiac as well, not just in the schools. We have issues and accusations of police brutality. When the uprising breaks out in Detroit in 1967, there is some limited looting here, but great fear pervasive throughout the community. There were businesses that were asking the police if they would be okay if they shot looters in the back. The police chief had to inform them, no, that would be illegal. But actually, a teenager was shot in 1967 by Art Law, who owned a corner store on Earlmore in the Black section of town. He was the state representative at the time, and before that had been mayor of Pontiac, so it caught a lot of attention in town. And in 1967, there was also a teen that was shot in the back by police, sort of fleeing from police, and that led to the Michigan Civil Rights Commission coming in, creating a committee, and bringing recommendations for ways that housing and policing, as well as education, can certainly work to improve what is becoming a really tense, but also potentially volatile situation. So that spills into the schools question as well. With the Civil Rights Act of 1964, the school board starts to realize, hey, we might need to actually move on that whole racial integration of the schools thing. We don't want to be desegregated. We don't want to be deemed as segregated. So they do take some limited steps, but emphasis on limited in the mid to late 1960s. And it's not until that uprising in Detroit, the assassination of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. in 1968, and then the advent of this lawsuit that we'll be talking shortly, that they really dial it up. And it's driven in part out of fear of legal repercussion that they lose in the courts, but also there was a real visceral fear in the white community and also in the civic leadership that this was a powder keg that of racial tension and animosity that could envelop the city, and there could be, on a smaller scale due to population, an uprising or racial violence that broke out here as well. The lawyer who is representing some of the victims of these police brutality cases is William Waterman. He was working with the NAACP, and this quote just kind of gives you a sense of the growing frustration of Black residents, and that's on the civil rights and the policing side. When it came to their schools, they were starting to mobilize and speak out to say, hey, our schools are in the Black neighborhoods are the older ones, they're run down, they're not getting the same supplies, you are not hiring Black principals, you are not hiring Black teachers, and that's in the 100% Black schools. There was this system where the principals could veto who the administrators were trying to place new teachers, and so the 100% white elementaries, their principals were vetoing any time that Lewis Crew or other personnel staff were trying to place new Black teachers and integrate the teaching staff. Those older white principals, they wanted to keep the status quo. They didn't want the parents to catch heck with them about the goings-ons of integrating the staff. That was too fast and too much for them. And there was a real palpable sense of despair and dismissiveness from the cities and schools leadership when it came to African-American residents. You see Waterman, Attorney Waterman on the right. His law partner, Elbert Hatchett, was president of the NAACP branch here. And it's in 1969 that they revisit the old Milton Henley question of, let's go to the courts, as that's been happening in other school districts around the country, to racially integrate Pontiac schools. As soon as they introduce that lawsuit, the school board administration starts moving quick to actually hire Black teachers, actually hire Black personnel, have Black principals in the majority Black school district schools, and they start to redraw the boundary lines for the high school and the middle schools or junior highs, so that way, at long last, Northern wasn't almost entirely white. They redrew the high school's boundary lines. And that's part of the reason why the lawsuit and the ensuing court order focused only on elementary schools, because the administration was able to make that magic happen. While we're on this slide, I just want to celebrate how brilliant legally attorneys Hatchett and Waterman were, and we'll get into that. But another thing that the school district starts doing is sensitivity training, because those older white teachers and principals I told you about, not only had they not interacted with Black students, they had not interacted with Black people. It was a real lack of familiarity and a lack of sort of commonality, even among the educated and, well-intentioned per se educators in the Pontiac schools. So this is the first in the country, it said, the first district-wide sensitivity training, or so it was reported in Time magazine, that they had 1,000+ teachers come together and have these hour-long sessions where they would literally just shake the hand of a Black person for the first time. And it leads to actually some terrible commentary where they're saying, oh, look, nothing came off. They're not dirty like I thought. Or I've heard this rumor that there's a smell about Black people. It's really insane, and we have to take ourselves back 50 years about what sort of racist and stereotypical tropes were out there, but it was also born out of that teachers weren't even integrated in the schools, in addition to the neighborhoods and the student population as well. There was a real fear born out of lack of exposure and ignorance to the humanity and the normality of their fellow humans of different races. This is all happening in this sort of real swirling intensity. When I'm telling you that a lot's happening at once, I can't even begin to bring you in, but it's intense. And part of the recommendations from the State Civil Rights Commission was, hey, you actually have to have a Black assistant superintendent to help you deal with this. So the school board says, okay, we'll do it. And then when the community and almost 100% of the 2,500 staff said, you should hire John Perdue, who's from the district, was principal at Bagley, and the school board said, no, we'll go with the other Black guy from out of state. Hundreds of people stormed the school board meetings. They told the other candidate, we're not interested. So rather than bend to community pressure, the school board said, okay, we'll just leave the position vacant. And Mr. Perdue wasn't given that position. Mr. Perdue was also the point person for a committee in the mid-60s dealing with race relations and drawing inferences from historical texts and oral histories I've conducted. I think that they would have considered Mr. Perdue uppity, and he was too much of an antagonist for racial change, and so they weren't interested in promoting him. And that became a part of the crux of the lawsuit for the racial desegregation of the schools and fundamentally of the staff. That doesn't get as much attention, but that was a real shortcoming, and the school district got called out for it. So the teachers were up in arms. They began boycotting to express their dissatisfaction about the school's administration and board not moving fast enough with staff and schools integration, and just hearing the voices of Black families and children. They also attempted to recall the whole school district's Board of Education. So in addition to recalls, boycotts, divided meetings, and protests, it manifests in many different ways, and it dials up the intensity that's happening in the community. That spills into the schools, not only in the streets, but in the schools where fights break out, and they are put in terms where it's viewed as Black versus white students. And at times in both 1969 and 1970, the schools have to be closed. The high school and a few of the middle schools, they straight up close it to try and cool things off. But it's seen that the parents are big antagonists in this, and that the children's sentiments, they're taking what they're hearing from home, and it's manifesting in the classrooms and in the neighborhoods. This is You can see how there was an outbreak after one of these clashes where they tried to close the schools. Gangs of white and black students came to downtown Pontiac, and all the businesses were afraid that chaos was going to, and violence was going to take out their businesses. But the fear and the rumor mill in the community was continuing to go on overdrive. It manifests also in the students feeling as though too much attention is being paid to the needs or the concerns of black students, and that's true overall in the community, where they're like, hey, what's with all these talk of black people and rights and all this civil rights movement, and you're catering to them, because the status quo was working great for white working class families in Pontiac. Not only were the jobs plentiful if there wasn't a recession, but that was amazing benefits and pay, and there were quality, affordable housing. And because of this amazing tax base with the automotive companies, that 9 out of every 10 tax dollars in Pontiac's coffers were from General Motors. Not only their property taxes of their massive facilities, but also their employee income taxes. That was providing amazing parks, community centers, recreation, city services, you name it. Pontiac was a beautiful, amazing place to live. And for white working class families, it was ideal. And so the disruption of that and the assertion that, well, actually for about 30,000 of the other people that live here, you might not know them and they might live far away from you, that they don't have it so good and they can't even live where they want to live. And it's this interesting white backlash that is coming through in this schools question, in addition to in the streets and in the neighborhoods. So now we've got that court case. It starts having the hearings in 1970. It's assigned to a federal judge from Detroit who's appointed by President Lyndon Johnson, Damon Keith. And he was a brilliant legal mind in his own right. And the attorneys who brought the case on behalf of the NAACP, Hatchett and Waterman, were amazing. So this is the transcript of that sort of few weeks of testimony. And I can tell you that I bust out laughing a few times just how clever and strong the Hatchett and Waterman legal duo was. And so the school district's position was like, hey, people just live where they live, and we've worked hard to try and accommodate, and work towards integration. We believe in integration, but people are going to live where they're going to live, and we're trying to move as fast as we can with those considerations. But their defense did not hold up, in part because it had been over 16 years since Brown versus Board of the Education, saying that constitutionally, under the 14th Amendment of the United States Constitution, that African Americans had a right to fair and equal services, and specifically to public education. And so they lost. And the ruling is that, one, you've got to integrate your elementary schools, but two, you got to integrate your staff. They tried right as the court case was working through the system to say, oh, well, all of our schools now have at least one black teacher. But that all of their sort of last minute efforts definitely undermined their legal standing because it showed that they can have a more racially integrated staff and provide and hire more black teachers and staff and administrators. But also in that court case, they kept emphasizing the school administrators. The only way we could integrate our elementary schools is if we had this massive busing and move children from elementary school to elementary school. And so ultimately, logistically, that was the only viable option. But as it's immediately appealed by the school board and it's working its way through the court system, there's an uncertainty in the community about what comes next. Meanwhile, the schools keep stepping in it, and McConnell School really takes center stage because it was one of the oldest in the city, and by this point, it's almost entirely Black and Mexican students there. It has rats running through it. It has exposed pipes. It's got children learning in the engineer's room in the basement. Part of the wall falls down. It's really intense. And then on top of it, the administration tries to place a white principal there. And so furthermore, more families and teachers boycott and speak out. Really intense. During this era, the school board has two African-American members. Christopher Brown on the left, who is a lawyer and was a law partner of Hatchett and Waterman, and Dr. Robert Turpin, a dentist. There was this power shift where the three gentlemen that you see at the front, those 3 board members were voting usually in favor of hiring Mr. Perdue, for example, as assistant soup, or making those more progressive decisions when it came to racial integration. But the majority of the board, the 4, were very much for the status quo and slow walking the integration process. After this court order comes out, it says, you're segregated and you need to desegregate quick. There is a school board election, and the voters overwhelmingly side against busing and against the court order. So Mr. Anderson had retired, and an anti-busing candidate, Mr. Jeffrey, was elected. And so that meant that there were 5 board members who were voting very much in opposition to moving quicker or trying with deliberate speed to make the resolution to the segregated elementary schools. Whitmer, as the superintendent, is not alone. These are thorny questions that are being put to major school districts across the country. Denver was ordered before Pontiac, and in that protest, 23 of their school buses were bombed. This is Whitmer at a conference with other superintendents that were facing the same trouble. And the community is uneasy because they're asking for the courts to throw it out. They don't know what's going to happen yet. So there's that fear of more violence. They're using curfews. And all the while this is happening, Pontiac is not in a vacuum. Detroit's massive school district was being ordered by a judge to desegregate their schools and do it with neighboring school districts. So since Detroit was becoming so predominantly African American, as every year goes by and as white families or next generations settle in the suburbs, the judge was actually going to have the suburban school districts bus white children into Detroit and vice versa. So anti-busing pandemonium grips Metro Detroit and Michigan. And we even see families moving as far as Lapeer or the Thumb or Livingston County and beyond, so that way they're beyond the clutches of bureaucrats or judges that would force children or families to be mandated through busing to integrate the schools. We find that busing becomes really like a stand-in. So rather than talk about desegregation or racial integration, it's all through busing, that this policy solution is the evil and we are against busing, and that becomes coded language and a stand-in for many, not all, but for many. We have a massive school district by this point in Pontiac, 24,000 kids, 28 elementary schools alone. You see them name checked there. Many of you may know them personally, and each school has its own fascinating history. This court order was impacting 9,000 of those elementary students, where they're pairing mainly Black schools with mainly white elementary schools and busing segments to try and create at least 40% minority presence and no more than 40% of minority students in the schools. It all comes to a head when their appeals have gone out and the school year in 1971 is about to start. It's been a year delay since the first court case and working through the criminal justice system. And this explosive situation literally explodes. On the night of August 30th, 1971, 6 members and former members of the Ku Klux Klan cut a hole in the bus yard fence and used dynamite to explode and blow up 10 Pontiac school buses of a fleet of 95. So they got 10 of them. This not only rocks the city, they literally can hear it in most parts of Pontiac and beyond. I know people in Lake Angeles said they definitely felt it and heard it, but it also grips the nation. So not only does the Associated Press and the New York Times pick it up, but it becomes the talk of the town, the state, the country, and makes international news. It's a big deal. The violence and the explosion really put the whole tense situation on steroids. Here's a view of those buses and the wreckage thereafter. It's worth pointing out that these buses were made in Pontiac. Buses were part of the bread and butter for General Motors in this era, specifically in Pontiac. And you can see some facilities of General Motors literally looming in the background at the Montcalm and Saginaw area, where the violence and calamity went down. Thank God nobody was injured. It was late at night, and 6 are arrested. 5 are eventually charged and brought to justice. But it really, here you see the individuals. One of them is Robert Miles. He is the former Grand Dragon of the Michigan Ku Klux Klan, sort of seen as the ringleader. And not only was it great for KKK publicity, but it definitely was trying to capitalize on the white anxiety and the white fear that the forced integration of Pontiac's schools definitely was causing, not only locally, but throughout the region. Here you see it manifested in a Detroit newspaper cartoon. And we have a really intense situation that, thank God, the superintendent, Dr. Whitmer, is seen as a level head who in the storm was able to be a guiding force. And in a perverse way, the violence of the bombing shook a lot of the community, shook them into reality, where they realized how serious and vulnerable the situation was. And while many families were not fans of the thought of logistically having some of their children bused or dealing with the court order, they were committed to making it work. Even the PTA president, Fran Anderson, had a Let's Make It Work campaign. And overwhelmingly, that was the sentiment of the community. Even though he had a steady hand, Dr. Whitmer was victim of violent threats, as was the attorneys. Attorney Waterman and his family had to evacuate their home. Same with Attorney Hatchett. And also the presiding judge, Damon Keith, his life was threatened. In fact, we have Waterman and Hatchett's law office on Orchard Lake Road still has a bullet hole in the window, and there were police officers with guns on the roof of their respective homes and offices to try and defend them from the violence. Even though this chaos has broken out, the school year will go forward. And it was really saluted that the violence did not dissuade the school district from proceeding ahead, and the busing to integrate the elementary schools literally rolled forward. Families, white families protested, chained themselves to fences, threw themselves in front of buses. A lot of really intense photography, great images, just in terms of showing how searing and visceral the situation is. And we have a really high-profile person enter the sphere, and that's Irene McCabe. She's a housewife and a mother from northern Pontiac, 4th Avenue, by the way. I see Gloria Harris Ford on there. She lived on your street. That they had a group called National Action Group, or NAG, and Irene was the point person for the Pontiac chapter, and she was great at capturing and generating attention, media attention. The attorney for their chapter was L. Brooks Patterson, and not only they weren't, NAG and McCabe and Patterson were in no way affiliated with the KKK or the violence that took place, but they were trying to use every legal or social or political trick in the book to try and stop this busing in its tracks. They demanded testing of the buses, testing of the drivers, basically try and undermine the process in any way they could, but the administrators and the courts kept things rolling. Here you see Irene with a massive protest at Hawthorne Park in Pontiac. This is an Associated Press picture that they picked up in September. And something really ugly that came out of these NAG gatherings. An attorney says, don't be afraid to be prosecuted. They can't prosecute all 4,000 of us. Even if they do, as long as we have some white people on the jury, you'll never be found guilty. So how's that for a perversion of the criminal justice system? Because there was not only civil disobedience, where McCabe and others are getting arrested for these protests and blockades, but they also were trying to do a mass boycott of the school year. 1/3 of white families hold their children out of school. They pull them and don't send them into school, and that's a matter of truancy. So they were talking in really malicious, in my opinion, ways. No, I think it's legitimately and empirically malicious about that if they just sort of overwhelm the criminal justice system, as long as there's a white person on the jury, they'll never be convicted. At that rally, we see former Florida governor and segregationist Claude Kirk try and get in on the attention. Richard Nixon is president at this time. It's earlier in his first term. He very strongly is opposed to busing and uses it as a social wedge issue, in part to be reelected president in 1972. As a political science major and political animal, I know I'd never heard of that, but doing the research back, it was absolutely such a hot button. George Wallace was actually the segregationist governor of Alabama. He won the 1972 Michigan Democratic primary for president off the anti-busing fervor. And so Nixon and other political figures are trying to out anti-busing one another. McCabe was a more sort of center example of that anti-busing, but it had an even more pernicious angle. The Nazis came to town, literally, and tried to get on the 15 Minutes of Fame. And it was something that really gripped the community. And the sense was that this was just too intense, this is too much, too dangerous, too scary, and not the right way to go about it. For many white families, they wanted something slower, something less controversial, but when it came to the school's integration, there really weren't other options. That's why it ended up this way. They did a Pontiac Press newspaper survey of should we bus children to racially integrate. 50 said yeah, over almost 6,000 said no, to give you a sentiment of where the population in the community was. We have the negative and the violent, but there's also the positive in that the court order was to racially integrate the elementary schools. And busing was their only logistical solution for how they could do it, absent massive moving of families. So since they went with the busing, on its face, the busing and the court order were successful because as of the 1971 school year, the elementary schools were racially integrated. That got a lot of attention about the busing and the violence, and McCabe versus Marie Johnson, an active Black community leader, and others, sort of this sort of both sidesism. And it obscures the question of actual integration of schools, and is racial integration desirable and legal? Yes, but it boiled down all about pro or anti-busing, and it made it almost as though both positions were equal. We have the U.S. Senate even bringing the Pontiac example. Then Senator Walter Mondale, later vice president, has a hearing where they're actually celebrating that Pontiac could be an example, a positive example of making it work. There were some children, as the school years went on, the months, that they sent more white children and relented and realized that mass violence and chaos weren't breaking out. There were some examples of violence. And in fact, the rumor mill was so crazy, they had to set up a hotline, a rumor line for you to call and say, hey, are Black people burning down the city? Or, hey, are gangs of white children beating up every Black child they see? That was like how dangerous and how intense the rumors were in town. So this was even before Facebook and Twitter, but it was going hot and heavy. But as that fear sort of subsided and those limited incidents, especially in the high school and ninth grade, died down, you saw more children coming home to the schools. But there still were about 1,000 students that immediately left the district and didn't come back, either to their families moved away immediately, or they went to private or parochial schools or home schools. It's worth pointing that out. So we've got start to look back a little bit. And here's just one quote from a family or graduate of Pontiac schools that's important because there was so much unfamiliarity and lack of exposure of Black and white residents, period, let alone students, let alone educators. And that was one strong success of the Pontiac schools even before this era, where once they got to high school, that they got to see that African-American neighbors are students like them with their own struggles and successes and abilities. But this did allow for both families, but definitely children, to be exposed to children of different races at an earlier rate. And that is a success of this racial integration process. We have, this is the Pontiac Northern's yearbook, where they're sharing how they perceive that it was a great obstacle, but that they overcame it and that it's a part of their lives. And you find a lot of the students weren't as up in arms as parents or community members were. So really quickly, as I try to make more room for questions, and we can delve into a lot of these angles, little highlights on some of the figures. Brooks Patterson, that attorney, went on to be springboard to county prosecutor in '72, the next year. We have in 1974, a U.S. Supreme Court court case where that Detroit question in Milliken v. Bradley, they ruled that no, it's not realistic to cross school district or county boundaries to try and bus to racially integrate. And Justice Thurgood Marshall had a very prescient quote when it's talking about the impact on the suburbs and the sort of segregation that will percolate as families of different races decamp to different communities and to different schools as a result, which for decades that was true for many Oakland County districts. We see Superintendent Whitmer retire in the late 70s. He's looked back as somebody who was a strong leader who helped navigate this very turbulent time. He was superintendent for a very long time, and he was honored by the Human Resource Center, a new school they were building in that era, was named in his honor. We have Patterson then becoming Oakland County Executive in 92. He was the longest serving county executive. He passed away recently. And it's worth pointing out, back to Whitmer, he was succeeded by Odell Nails, who was earlier principal at Jefferson Middle Junior High. He was the first Black superintendent for Pontiac School District and for any school district in Oakland County. Attorney Hatchett, posing there when they did it 25 years later with Brooks, he was a wildly successful attorney, massive victories, and he is still with us. He is very advanced in age, and we give him our prayers and well wishes for his health and well-being. School board member Brown becomes Judge Brown in Pontiac District Court. Attorney Waterman becomes Judge Waterman. And his wife, who was fleeing that violence and those threats during that era, she is now the current mayor of Pontiac. So Dr. Deirdre Holloway Waterman is the widow of attorney and then Judge Waterman. Irene McCabe went on to be a realtor in Clarkston, selling homes to families that were fleeing that white flight out of Pontiac and even out of Detroit. But she definitely felt used as a political pawn for politicians that were trying to get attention. It worked for them, and she got 15 minutes of fame, but she still was opposed to busing in later decades and felt she was right. It's worth putting all this story in context if you try and look back on Pontiac and say, oh, it was busing that did Pontiac in, or if only they didn't have this meddling court order, Pontiac would be great. Well, Pontiac had challenges in the 1910s, they had challenges in the 1970s, and they have challenges today. And that's over and beyond just the question of schools and integration of schools. We were a one-company town, as I shared, and General Motors evolved to where they once had 30,000 employees in Pontiac, now have about 3,000. They have literally been decimated for a variety of factors, but from the 80s until now, it really shrank, and we have a shell of the sort of the tax base as well as the employment opportunities in our community. Real quick, as I start to conclude, here's the elementary schools of the then 28 that still are in operation or are owned by the school district. Most are either gone, demolished, sold. The names in white are no longer property or no longer exist, but no longer property of the Pontiac schools. And through the years of the declining enrollment and the declining birth rate, we have Pontiac schools having a massive drop in students, but so many schools because it was built for 24,000 students and growing. So to make that recalibration, it didn't happen fast enough, and schools with a fraction of the students and staff with the fraction of the workload, that caught up in the late 2000s where Pontiac schools racked up a big deficit. I'm pleased to report only a few days ago that has been eliminated. Today, there are 4,000 students in the Pontiac schools compared to the 24,000 at the height. And we can, in the question, start going even deeper in terms of what comes next, or what did that 50 years afterward mean for the community. It's a very layered, multifaceted question that's impacted by so many factors. But most importantly, before we launch into questions, we want to hear your stories. There are 85,000 different experiences, not all of them, sadly, still with us, but 85,000 different experiences and perspectives. And there are 24,000 different students who had their own lived experiences. We want to hear from you, how it impacted your family in the decades afterward, the decades leading up. If you worked in the schools, our historical society lives for that. And all this year, we are collecting oral histories, and we want to hear your picture. You see your pictures, hear your stories. And if I missed something, or for the sake of time, I just sort of glanced over something that's a really big deal, let us know. So that way we capture that and make the story stronger. So that way the history can be saved forevermore, but also passed on to the generations to come for Pontiac in Oakland County. So with that, I'll stop sharing my screen, or do whatever the Literacy Council wants to do as we start fielding as many questions as the audience has and that the Zoom time will allow it.
And I believe I am back on camera.
You are.
Mike, an excellent job. This is really a fabric of our community here. And it's really a shame that sometimes this historical situation and what happened in Pontiac really isn't socialized well. And so it is so important, as we said in our opening, that we're providing this type of education to our local community so we don't forget those lessons learned and really can move forward, educated, in the know, and really learning lessons from the past. And so thank you for that. And so now it is time for our official Q&A section. As you can see at the bottom of your screen, and take some time to find it, you should see a Q&A. We already have 8 different questions that are into the queue here. And so I'm going to start there. There may be some questions popping up in the chat, but we're really going to focus on those in the actual official Q&A section. And so thank you for that. And so we will take the first one. And so we'll kick it off with a question. And so one of our participants has said, I've read somewhere about the Pontiac School Board redrawing internal district lines several times to maintain segregation. Is this accurate?
Yes, and I'm glad you've raised that. Before 1954, they didn't even really have lines. You would attend the school that kind of was close to you, but really it was black students there, white students there. That was the pre-1954 plan. So when Brown court case comes along, then they're like, okay, I guess we got to draw zone boundaries. So they have the neighborhood schools concept where you are basically attending the school closest to you. And that was sort of their, colorblind approach. It all depends on where you live. But there were caveats. They would bus white students out of black areas and draw the lines just so that way if there's pockets of black or white students, that it would reinforce where the students of different races would attend school. And that's what we sort of refer to as administrative segregation. The whole situation came up legally with, is it de facto segregation, which means it's just a matter of fact, that's where people live. So, hey, we can't control where people live, or even though they did. Or is it de jure segregation, where they're explicitly making separate schools, blacks there, whites there? This is sort of a hybrid situation where administratively they were segregating. One example is that where Hayes Jones, who went on to get a gold medal out of Pontiac in the 60s, he lived on Murray and Lafayette Street, where it's kind of demolished now because of the Woodward Loop and wide track. But there was a pocket of black residents that were just north of downtown Pontiac. And they had the Cora Bailey School, where they intentionally had just a small handful of students, black students, going to Cora Bailey, and they didn't use other classes there or expand the enrollment there. Another example is Washington Park. It was being bused, and it was all white at the time, across from Home Depot today, beautiful neighborhood. But it was all white in the earlier decades, and they would bus the white students there over to Whitfield School in Sylvan Lake, when they could have just as easily bused a similar route to Bagley or then Bethune, which was then a newer school in the late 50s. That wasn't done, and that was a great example in the court case where they'd say, hey, you're being very selective. And another great example is the Bloomfield Township portion of Pontiac schools. At the Square Lake and Middle Belt area, that's Pontiac schools. Well, by the 1940s, 50s, and 60s, the very wealthy residents of those neighborhoods weren't that fond of it. And so in part to cater to their very wealthy tax base, the Pontiac schools built them their own little tiny elementary school, Irving School. The school's gone, but the building's still there. It's the Muslim Center on Square Lake Road. That was built for just 169 students. So that way, only the people in Bloomfield Hills, they got their own little elementary school versus what would be the closest existing schools, which were Bagley, Bethune, Whittier, Jefferson, the almost exclusively Black schools. And so there is the drawing of the lines, but there's also the re-engineering of where out pockets will go. For time, I also wasn't able to dive into the hot button of they were going to build a third high school. So we had Pontiac Central, Pontiac Northern, and things were going so crazy. They're like, Pontiac's growth is never going to end. We need a third super high school. They were going to build it at Johnson and Elizabeth Lake Roads on the Pontiac State Hospital site, on the grounds of the asylum, because there was land there, but also that was an entirely Caucasian neighborhood in that vicinity. And it was also to serve the Sylvan Lake and the Waterford, AKA entirely white communities that were part of the school district, rather than building it at Bagley and Orchard Lake, which would have been right in the heart of the Black community, and meaning that they were sending the most new tax investments into the Black neighborhoods for a high school that would then be new and modern for Black residents and their children. And that led to 6,000 petitions signed to say, build the high school at the asylum at the state hospital. It was a really intense. So there's all these different layers when it comes to how administratively the schools were being segregated to keep the status quo, to keep the races separated, because that's what the white population, that's what they were after. And that's not 100%, that's not across the board, but it's real. And I'm really glad that you asked that question, because that's such an important element that for time I couldn't get to. In the 1960s, they are drawing the lines much more realistically, but there still were those outliers, like I shared with you at Irving, Whitfield, and for Bethune. There was the question of Orchard Lake Road there, where the administrators would say, well, we don't want the kids crossing, it's dangerous to cross that busy road, Orchard Lake. But they would have Black kids walk across Orchard Lake to go to Crowfoot, which was a integrated / majority Black elementary, but they wouldn't have them cross Orchard Lake to go to Webster, which was the largest, most affluent, and in the nicest part of town. That beautiful, beautiful elementary school where you went, Alicia. Webster is amazing, but that really came out in the court case, and that was really palpable in the community.
Thank you for that, Mike. Very informative. And so we're going to go on to our next question. And from the audience we have, I live in Oxford, and I'm wondering, how did the white flight after these desegregation efforts benefit surrounding districts?
Well, it benefited from population, Oxford included. The exodus, which already was happening when you have an older community with an older housing stock. And it was a beautiful historic town and still is, but they kind of glommed on top of that an industrial center. It became this, manufacturing hub. And if, objectively speaking, if you start to get more money and you're more well off, it's not ideal. But so there was already that exodus happening. And then this just threw kerosene on the situation where if you had children, school-age children, you were thinking, ooh, do I want to be part of this? Even if you're setting aside the race question. And then for many thousands of white families, it was, do I want my kids going with the Black kids? You see what they're doing down there? So the surrounding school districts have new population of residents, new tax base, and they've got a whole bunch more kids. And the student head count is important for state funding. So that's the most immediate ramifications. There were NAG chapters in Oxford and other outlying parts of Oakland County because they didn't know where this was going to, snowball into. There was at one point the thought that districts like Oxford and Waterford and Lake Orion, that they'd have to do a swapping of students to racially integrate their schools too. They didn't know what was to come because there was so much rapid change and a lot of judicial outcomes that they didn't know what would happen, as I mentioned with the Detroit example.
Thank you. And so we have our next question, some audience engagement, not even just in the chat, but also in the Q&A. We had a question, where was the bus yard located and what is there now? And actually an audience member chimed in to say that the bus yard was located at Montcalm and North Saginaw, across from Pontiac Motors, which I had family members work there as well, and that the building is now a warehouse for the schools. And so anything to add to that?
Yeah, it is today the Fell Center, named for an assistant superintendent during the same era, Richard Fell. So it's still property of the school district. And we've just recently, the contractor that does our transportation, they are parking the buses in that very same spot. And so this is, I think, a fitting year to consider how we might want to mark and denote that very historic spot, because even if our past has ugly incidents, we learn from them and we understand the trauma that influenced our community. There also hasn't been a lot of healing. That's why I'm really grateful for the Oakland Literacy Council to do this partnership, because for tens of thousands of families, it kind of just was this really scary and uncertain time. And then it just kind of is fading, even though it had a real direct impact on their life or where they lived. There hasn't been much closure or acknowledgement. And so I view this year as an opportunity for a little bit of truth and reconciliation, not only for the Pontiac community, but for the region, because this isn't a story limited to us. I really want to expand on something very briefly that I didn't get to, and that's when you're talking about how did it impact other school districts. For Pontiac School District, in the immediate years that followed, millages are when votes come to the people to say, hey, will you invest more tax dollars to improve a school or hire more teachers or cover our budget shortfalls? And for decades after this incident, Pontiac voters said no. And that really hurt Pontiac schools' ability to handle the finances and sort of deal with the churning and change that was present. And that's a big deal that doesn't get talked about logistically. But as a board trustee, I could tell you that it really had a big impact in terms of the quality and caliber as the decades went on that Pontiac schools were suffering, and that facilitated even more departure as the years went on. More people would move to another district in part to seek a stronger school district, and it'd be a whole other presentation. But in Michigan today, with schools of choice and the most charter schools in the country that have been authorized, that has really put on steroids that transformation and that hollowing out of Pontiac's public schools.
Thank you. And another critical question. So 50 years later, the anniversary, was busing in Pontiac considered a success?
Almost universally, busing is considered a failure, and not just in Pontiac, but nationally. There's even a book that says, Why Busing Failed. Who's on the cover? Pontiac Schools. That picture I showed you by Matthew Delmont, a professor from Arizona State. Great read. We have it in our research library here. But it's really talking about how it becomes almost like this wedge issue in this media construction where it's all about busing. So in the macro level, did busing make race relations better in Pontiac? Usually it's fair to say no. Did busing improve their fellow man's opinion of one another? No. Did it make Pontiac a stronger or more desirable school district? No. Did it cause a lot of tumult and trauma? Yeah. But did busing immediately racially integrate Pontiac's public schools? Yes. The bigger, sort of broader societal question is, putting aside busing, was the process of racially integrating Pontiac's public schools a success? And fundamentally and legally, it is not only the right thing to have done, but it was the legally obligated under our United States Constitution to be done. But almost, if you ask any person, even if they were advocating for busing at the time, hoping for the best, they would think that because of educational outcomes, because of how Pontiac as a community lost population, lost prestige, lost wealth, even though there are many other factors that go into that, they consider busing to be a failure. But I'm trying to look at it more objectively and say it was the only option they had logistically to immediately integrate the elementary schools, short of reversing time and not putting in all those racially restrictive housing options in Pontiac. This was a time bomb that was set decades prior and reinforced by the existing sort of majoritarian and power dynamic that was going on. If it did not manifest with this court case, it may have come to a more explosive head in another way. And if it did not manifest even with schools, it would have come to a potentially violent head another way. And so we never get to know, sort of in those choose your own adventures births, we never get to know what happens on the other course. But I think that we should begin 50 years later looking to say, not only are Pontiac schools racially integrated then, it happened very quickly, but they made it happen. But they were racially integrated for the years that followed, and it created a faster racial integration of the Pontiac community. But many people look at the question of, well, the white families that fled, or the loss of the students, that's a failure. So it really is in terms of from what perspective you're looking at it. But busing as a solution to the desegregation problem was successful for Pontiac, and ultimately it was not met with as much violence or loss or calamity as it could have, and as it had in other parts of the country.
Thank you. And our next question, I think we're only going to take one or two more. We want to be respectful of your time. This has been a great engagement. The next question is, were there any leadership exercised by the churches in Pontiac, particularly about the busing and the redlining? Which churches and what did they do?
Great question. And I know I want to dive into that question more. Unfortunately, there's limited first source material. I can tell you that prior to the court order coming down, there was a coalition of churches that came together. I'm a parishioner at All Saints Episcopal Church, and it always, my spidey sense goes off when All Saints is invoked. So All Saints and a coalition of, about 5 or 6 other churches. It wasn't, the full ecumenical breadth of the community by any stretch of the imagination, but they were advocating for the integration of Pontiac's public schools. And George Whitfield is that All Saints rector at the time. It is a small handful. And if I go back, and hopefully with more research, we'll find where the Black church is adding their voice in a way which is undeniably so. I just haven't been able to see much source material on that. So if your family, if anyone on this presentation, if you have any anecdotal or first-person experience, let us know, so that way we can add to our robust understanding of the religious organizations in our community. At that time, there was a Jewish temple in Pontiac still. They were part of advocating for racial integration. And the Black churches and the missionary Baptist churches were definitely at the forefront for advocating for progress for African-American residents. One strong example is Trinity Missionary Baptist Church on Wesson Street. That is where Dr. Martin Luther King in the 1950s came to speak in Pontiac. And there are other brilliant examples. Today, there are like 100 plus churches in Pontiac. There's a lot. So if you take yourself back, there was a definite racial split when it comes to houses of worship. There's one Pontiac Press quote where it says, the most segregated day and time of the week is Sunday at 11 o'clock because of the way in which, families were worshiping with other families of the same race. And the Black church, though, has had such an important and instrumental role in the Pontiac community. Just was debriefing with one of our Historical Society members about how, think of in that Great Migration, coming from the Deep South, you're often the only family member coming. You may have known a friend or a relative who's already in Pontiac, and that's why you're coming here, but you might literally know nobody. And then through your church, that is your surrogate support network in those early decades. And so the role that the Black church played in Pontiac in those early decades, we need to learn more about it, but it is undeniable in terms of the soft and hard power that they exercised through advocating for civil rights in Pontiac. And the NAACP organization leadership often was mirroring Black pastors in the community as well. And it's usually Black pastors because of their community standing and hopefully the might of God on their side, are the first to racially integrate some neighborhoods, moving north of Orchard Lake Road onto Franklin Boulevard, for example, where a number of the pastors, including from New Bethel and Reverend Johnson. So just want to put that out there too. There's so much more that we can use. More stories. We want more. Give us knowledge.
Thank you. And audience, you heard the call for action. With your help, we can keep this history alive. And so one final question that will go to close. 50 years later, what is the current racial mix in Pontiac schools, students and faculty, if you know it?
Sure. We have, like I mentioned, 4,000 students, but there are actually 11,000 school-aged children that live in the footprint of Pontiac schools. It still has those 8 municipalities, all or in part, that I shared. There have been moves over the decades. Sylvan Lake tried to flee. They wanted to get out of the Pontiac schools because of property values and tax rates. Bloomfield Township tried to get out. But so of the remaining 4,000 students who have not, we have about 900 kids that school of choice go to West Bloomfield alone. So of the 4,000 remaining, approximately 30% are English language learners and Hispanic students. That's the largest in the county, and I think probably in the state. We have such a rich Mexican American and Puerto Rican population in Pontiac, and they are some of our biggest consumers of the school district. We also have a third of the students who are, this is just a tangential aside, who have individualized education plans, or that they have developmental or educational challenges. That's also the highest in Oakland County. Because we are that public school district, we are guaranteed to serve all students. But to the racial composition, approximately 10% of our students are white, 30% are Hispanic, and 60+% are African American students. So if the question was, is Pontiac schools, racially integrated today? Well, opportunities are afforded now all equitably, no matter where you live, no matter your economic status, and no matter your race. And so in that respect, but there is not as much of a commingling of multiple races in terms of where we stand today.
Thank you.
Oh, but I didn't say staff. So there is a very racially diverse staff, but we actually have the converse where there's now more white teachers compared to the overall student population. And teaching, the teaching corps in Michigan has really taken a beating in the last few decades, where we don't have as many teachers straight up, but also teachers of color are very much in high demand in districts around the state. So if you know somebody, let them know that Pontiac schools would be delighted to be their workplace of choice.
Thank you. And Mike, again, we would like to just congratulate you in the Oakland History Center for keeping our history alive. The presentation that you've given today has been thought-provoking, engaging. I think it really pricked the hearts of many of the participants in the chat and the Q&A that not only live through this history, but are dedicated to making sure that it isn't forgotten. And as I mentioned in the beginning of this presentation, you are all going to receive a survey after this event so that you can give feedback. Your feedback matters. We want to continue to bring you educational programming such as that is really going to engage you where you're at, and hopefully you can bring your friends and family as well. And remember, this conversation is just the beginning and not the end. So in that survey, you'll also see a call for action. Next Thursday, February 25th at 7 p.m., this conversation is going to continue. So for those that have not seen the presentation today, don't worry, it will be available for recording. I believe it'll be posted on YouTube and probably also shared on our website for the Oakland Literacy Council. And just know that our organization is dedicated to learning inequities and really engaging with those adult learners, because we understand that when things like this happen in history in terms of education, some people get left behind, and it's our job and duty as a community to make sure that regardless of your race, ethnicity, sexual orientation, religious beliefs, things of that nature, that no one misses the opportunity to learn how to read and engage. And so again, Mike, thank you for what you presented today. And I will turn it over for a few closing comments.
It's really been an honor. We have just scratched the surface, and these are really complex, intense times that involved so many thousands of families. So we're really grateful that you took the time to learn a little bit more, even if you had no frame of reference, even if you just want to learn a little bit more about the place you live now or the place that you lived decades ago. We know from some of the registrants, this is something that in fact impacted you personally and you'd like to know more about it. So we hope we did that tonight. Thank you again to Michigan Schools and Government Credit Union for sponsoring tonight. And thank you on behalf of the History Center. Thank you to the Literacy Council for this partnership. We're grateful to offer this stimulating history. This is an amazing community and this is an amazing county. And we have so much more to learn from in our past to keep growing forward in the future.
Thank you.